The wind had a voice, and it spoke of ruin. It was a high, thin scream that tore through the black pines of the Sierra Nevada, carrying with it a blinding fury of snow. The world had been reduced to two things: a whirling, suffocating white, and the biting cold that seeped through the layers of Eliza Hart's worn wool coat, leaching the life from her bones. She had lost the wagon road hours ago. Now, there was no road, no path, only the punishing depth of the snow that caught at her skirts and filled her boots. Each step was a battle fought and barely won. Her lungs burned. The hunger in her belly was a dull, constant ache that had long since passed the point of sharpness. Boston, with its brick-lined streets and the rigid certainty of its days, felt like a story someone else had lived. The life that had been promised to her there, a marriage to a wealthy merchant, a future secured by a debt she had not incurred, was the very thing that had driven her into this wilderness. She had chosen the unknown over the cage, but she had not understood that the unknown could have teeth like this. Panic was a luxury she could no longer afford. It had been replaced by a cold, leaden despair. She stumbled, catching herself against the rough bark of a pine, her breath coming in ragged, frosted clouds. It would be so easy to simply lie down, to let the snow cover her like a final, quiet blanket. But some stubborn, flickering ember of defiance refused to be extinguished. It was the same fire that had made her pack a small bag in the dead of night and board a westbound train. The same fire that had her teaching letters to rough miners' children in a dusty camp for a handful of coins. It was the fire of a life that insisted on being her own. And then she saw it, through a momentary thinning of the swirling snow. A light. It was small and yellow, impossibly warm against the cold blue twilight. A pinprick of hope in the vast, indifferent wilderness. For a moment, she thought her mind was playing tricks on her, conjuring a phantom to lure her to her end, but it held steady. A lamp in a window. Renewed strength, born of desperation, surged through her. She pushed herself away from the tree and lurched toward the light, her legs moving with a clumsy, mechanical rhythm. The cabin, when she finally reached it, was little more than a dark shape against the snow, a trapper's lean-to built of rough-hewn logs, chinked with mud and moss. Smoke curled from a stone chimney, a fragile ribbon immediately torn to shreds by the wind. The smell of burning pine was the most welcoming scent she had ever known. She stood before the heavy wooden door for a long moment, her heart hammering against her ribs. What sort of man lived this far from civilization, alone in the teeth of winter? A hermit, an outlaw. She raised a numb hand, her knuckles barely making a sound against the wood. She tried again, louder this time. The scraping of a bolt being drawn back echoed from within, and the door swung inward. The man who filled the doorway seemed to block out all the light. He was immense, a giant of a man with shoulders that strained the seams of his deerskin shirt and a dark, full beard that hid the lower half of his face. The warm, yellow lamplight from inside caught the weariness in his eyes the color of a winter sky just before the sun gives up. He was not old, perhaps in his early 30s, but he looked as if he had been carved from the mountain itself, weathered and solid. Eliza took an involuntary step back, the sheer size of him a physical force. The words escaped her lips before she could stop them, a raw whisper of fear and, strangely, of relief. "You are so big you could break me." The man's expression did not change for a long moment. He simply looked at her, his gaze taking in her snow-caked coat, her chattering teeth, the raw fear in her eyes. Then, the corner of his mouth tilted in a smile so slight it was almost lost in his beard. His voice, when he spoke, was the opposite of his frame, a low, quiet rumble, as gentle as the firelight. "All the more reason to be gentle," he said. He stepped back, holding the door wide. "Come in before the storm takes you." She did not need to be told twice. Eliza stumbled over the threshold into the small, one-room cabin. The warmth was a blissful shock, a physical presence that wrapped around her and made her dizzy. The air was thick with the scent of wood smoke, brewing coffee, and something savory simmering in a pot over the hearth. The space was meticulously tidy. Furs were stacked neatly in one corner. Traps and tools hung from pegs on the wall, and a worn but clean quilt was folded at the foot of a simple rope bed. The man closed the door, shutting out the howl of the wind. "My name is Jonah McQuaid." "Eliza Hart," she managed, her voice trembling. He gestured to a stool by the fire. "Sit, get yourself warm." She obeyed, sinking onto the stool and holding her frozen hands out to the flames. The feeling that returned to them was 1,000 tiny, painful needles. Jonah moved about the cabin with a quiet economy of motion, ladling a thick, dark stew into a wooden bowl. He handed it to her with a piece of hard bread. It was a simple meal of rabbit and root vegetables, but to Eliza, it was the finest feast she had ever tasted. She ate quickly, greedily, while he sat on the other side of the hearth, cleaning a rifle with a practiced, unhurried rhythm. He did not press her with questions. He seemed content to sit in silence, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the ceaseless moan of the wind against the log walls. This quiet acceptance was more comforting than any words could have been. In the flickering firelight, she saw a long, faded scar that ran along the back of his left hand, a pale line against the weathered skin. He was a man who knew hardship. When she had finished the stew, he took the empty bowl from her and handed her a tin mug of hot, black coffee. The warmth spread through her, chasing away the last of the deep-seated chill. "You are a long way from any town, Miss Hart," Jonah said, his voice still low and even. It was a statement, not a question. "I was," she admitted, her gaze dropping to the flames. "I was heading for Hallow Creek. The stagecoach line stopped running for the winter, so I paid a man with a wagon. The storm, it came on so fast. He said we had to turn back. But I could not go back." The last words were barely a whisper. Jonah nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving the rifle he was oiling, running from something. The quiet directness of his question made it impossible to lie. She looked at this strange, enormous man who had saved her life, and a measure of the truth spilled out. "From a promise," she said softly, "one that was made for me. I was raised in a convent school in Boston. The school fell into debt, and the Mother Superior, she made an arrangement, a contract. She promised me in marriage to a man I have never met, a merchant, in exchange for him clearing the convent's debts." She saw his hand still for a moment on the rifle. "It was all done with paper and ink," she continued, the shame and anger making her voice tight, as if I were a parcel to be traded. "I was told it was my duty. But I believe my duty is to God and my own conscience, not to a ledger book. So I left. I took what little money I had and came west. I will not be bought and sold." Jonah finished his work and set the rifle aside. He looked at her then, his gaze direct and serious. "No one should be," he said. He rose and pulled the patched quilt from the bed. "You can take the bed. I will sit by the fire." "No, I cannot possibly," she began, but he cut her off with a simple shake of his head. "You are exhausted and half frozen. I am not. There is no argument to be had." There was a finality in his tone that allowed for no protest, defeated by his simple, unmovable kindness. Eliza laid down on the cot, pulling the heavy, warm quilt over her. It smelled faintly of wood smoke in the cold, clean air of the mountains. From the bed, she watched him settle into his chair by the fire, a dark, silent guardian against the storm that raged outside. For the first time in months, Eliza Hart felt something akin to safety. She woke to the smell of frying bacon and the sound of the wind, which had not lessened its assault on the cabin. Daylight was a dim, gray affair, filtering weakly through the single window. Jonah was at the hearth, turning strips of bacon in a cast-iron skillet. He glanced over as she sat up. "The storm is not letting up," he said. "We will be here another day. At least Eliza felt a strange mix of relief and anxiety. She was safe, but she was also trapped. They were halfway through a breakfast of bacon and day-old bread when a frantic pounding on the door made them both jump. Jonah grabbed the rifle that was leaning against the hearth and moved to the door, his large frame tense. "Who is it?" he called out. "Arthur Pendleton, United States Mail," a voice shouted, thin and reedy against the wind. "My horse went lame, and I saw your smoke. For the love of God, man, let me in." Jonah unbolted the door to reveal a small, wiry man covered head to toe in snow, his face blue with cold and his mustache frozen into 2 white icicles. He practically fell into the room, a large leather mailbag slung over his shoulder. "McQuaid, I should have known this was your place. Only you would be stubborn enough to winter this high up," the man chattered, rubbing his hands together furiously. He nodded toward Eliza, his eyes wide with surprise, but the cold seemed to have frozen any questions in his throat. "Sit by the fire, Arthur," Jonah said, closing the door again. "Warm yourself." The mail carrier did as he was told, pulling off his frozen gloves and spreading his numb fingers toward the flames. "This is the worst blow I have seen in a decade. Lost the trail completely. If I had not seen your chimney—" He shivered, leaving the rest unsaid. His mailbag slipped from his shoulder and landed on the floor with a soft thud. A few loose papers slid out onto the rough wooden planks. "Let me get you some coffee," Jonah said, turning to the pot. Arthur bent to gather his scattered mail, his fingers still clumsy with cold. "Damn contracts and notices, not worth freezing to death for," he muttered. Eliza knelt to help him, her eyes falling on one of the papers that had slid near the hearth. The letterhead was thick, expensive paper, incongruous in the rustic cabin. At the top, in elegant, sharp lettering, were the words Argent and Company. Below it was a drawing of her own face, a passable likeness taken from a photograph the convent had possessed. And beneath that, the words that made the blood drain from her face. "Notice of disputed property." Her name was printed in stark black ink, Eliza Hart. The notice went on to describe her as having absconded from a legally binding contractual obligation. It offered a reward for information leading to her recovery. It was signed at the bottom with a bold, arrogant flourish. "Silas Bixby, Regional Director, Argent and Company." Property. The word was a brand, searing itself into her mind. She felt a wave of nausea and shame so profound it took her breath away. She was not a runaway. She was a piece of disputed property, a runaway horse, a lost piece of luggage. The mail carrier, seeing the look on her face, snatched the paper from the floor. "Apologies. Miss, this is official company business, not for public eyes." He stuffed it hastily back into his bag, his face now flushed with embarrassment. Jonah turned from the fire, the coffee pot still in his hand. He had seen the paper. He had seen her face as she read it. He looked from her to the mail carrier, and his expression hardened. The gentle quietness in his eyes was replaced by something colder, something as hard as the mountain granite. Arthur Pendleton seemed to shrink under his gaze. "Just doing my job. Jonah, you know how it is. Argent and Company runs everything down in Hallow Creek. Their mail takes priority." Jonah said nothing. He simply poured a mug of coffee and handed it to the shaken man. An hour later, sufficiently warmed and fortified, Arthur Pendleton ventured back out into the storm, heading for the relative safety of his lame horse, which he had tied in a small lean-to behind the cabin. The silence he left behind was heavier than before. Eliza sat on the stool, wrapping her arms around herself, unable to look at Jonah. The fragile sense of safety she had felt was shattered. The outside world, with its contracts and its ledgers, had found her. "He is the man from the contract," she said, her voice a dead monotone. "Silas Bixby. He must have purchased the convent's debt." Jonah walked over to the window, peering out at the white chaos. The large prints his boots made in the snow near the cabin door were already being erased by the wind. His strength, which had been a comfort, now seemed like a reminder of how powerless she was. "Hallow Creek is an Argent town," he said, his back to her. "The mine, the store, the sheriff, they all draw their pay from Bixby's coin." Despair washed over her. Then there is nowhere to go. He turned from the window, and his eyes met hers. The coldness was gone, replaced by a steady, resolute calm. He was no longer just a kind stranger. He was a man who had made a choice. "The storm will break," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to fill the small cabin. "By tomorrow, maybe the day after. When it does, I am taking you down to Hollow Creek." She stared at him, confused. "But you said the town belongs to them." "It does," he agreed. "But the law is supposed to belong to everyone. That notice called you property. A piece of paper does not make a person a thing. We will go down there, and we will find the truth in this. We will not wait for them to come find you." He hated towns. She could see it in the set of his jaw. He was a man of the mountain, of silence and solitude, but he was willing to walk into the heart of his own discomfort, into the center of Silas Bixby's power. For her, for a woman he had met only the day before. Outside, the wind howled, but inside the small cabin, a decision had been made, a line had been drawn. The snow would stop, and when it did, the real storm would begin. 2 days later, the world was born anew. The wind had wept itself to silence, and the sun broke over the high peaks, shattering its light across a landscape of impossible, brilliant white. The snow lay in deep, sculptural drifts, softening the hard edges of the rock and bowing the branches of the black pines into graceful, heavy arcs. It was a beauty so pure and profound it ached to look at, a world scrubbed clean of all its history. The journey down from the mountain was slow and deliberate. Jonah McQuaid moved with an easy, long-limbed stride, his big snowshoed boots packing a trail for Eliza to follow. He carried his rifle in one hand and a walking staff in the other, his eyes constantly scanning the drifts ahead, the trees, the sky. In this wild, silent world, he was utterly at home. Eliza, following in the path he made, felt like a child learning to walk again. She focused on placing her feet in his tracks, a simple act of trust that felt more significant than any words they had exchanged. As they descended, the character of the land began to change. The air grew thicker, and the pristine silence was gradually replaced by the distant, rhythmic clang of metal on metal, the ceaseless, hungry heartbeat of the Hollow Creek stamp mill. The first sign of the town itself was not a welcoming light, but a plume of greasy, black smoke rising from a tall stack, a dark stain against the pristine blue sky. Eliza saw Jonah's shoulders tense. The easy grace he possessed in the wilderness began to fall away, replaced by a guarded stillness. He was a man returning to a place he did not belong. Hollow Creek was not nestled in the valley. It was clawed into it. A single muddy street, churned to a frozen morass by wagon wheels and horse hooves, snaked between 2 rows of grim, unpainted wooden buildings. Everything was coated in a fine layer of gray dust from the mine, a permanent grit that even the new snow could not completely hide. Men in heavy coats and worn boots stopped to stare as they entered the street, their face smudged with grime. They looked at Jonah with a mixture of suspicion and grudging respect, the way they might look at a bear that had wandered too close to town. Then their eyes shifted to Eliza, and the looks changed to open, undisguised curiosity. She pulled her cloak tighter, feeling the weight of their gazes like a physical touch. The whispers started almost immediately, a low murmur that followed them down the street. Jonah led her to a 2-story building that seemed a little sturdier than the rest, with a painted sign that read Crow's Boarding House, clean beds and fair meals. He pushed the door open, and they stepped into a room that was an oasis of warmth and order. The air smelled of baking bread and strong soap. A fire roared in a large stone hearth, and the wooden floors, though worn, were scrubbed clean. A woman stood behind a long counter, polishing a glass with a white cloth. She was somewhere past 50, with iron gray hair pulled back in a severe bun that could not quite contain a few rebellious wisps. Her face was a map of worldly experience, and her eyes, a sharp and intelligent blue, missed nothing. She looked from Jonah's imposing frame to Eliza's pale, drawn face, and set the glass down with a decisive click. "Jonah McQuaid," she said, her voice dry but not unkind. "I figured the blizzard would either kill you or send you down looking for coffee that does not taste of pine needles. I see it did the latter." Her eyes lingered on Eliza. "And you have brought a guest." "Mabel, this is Eliza Hart," Jonah said, his voice low. "She was caught in the storm. She needs a room, a warm one." Mabel Crow's sharp gaze softened for a fraction of a second as she looked at Eliza. "Caught in the storm is a gentle way of putting it. By the look of her, poor thing. You look like a half-drowned sparrow." She came around the counter, her movements brisk and efficient. "Come with me, dear. We will get a hot bath drawn for you and find you something to eat that is not jerky or hardtack." She led Eliza toward a set of stairs, then paused and looked back at Jonah. "And you, McQuaid, you will have a bowl of my onion soup and tell me what sort of trouble you have dragged this child into." It was not a question, it was a command. The simple luxury of a hot bath in a tin tub, of scrubbing away the grime and the fear of the last few days, felt like a resurrection. Mabel provided her with a simple, borrowed dress of dark blue calico that was a little too large, but wonderfully clean. When Eliza came back downstairs, her hair still damp, a steaming bowl of rich onion soup and a thick slice of fresh bread were waiting for her on a small table near the fire. Jonah was sitting opposite, his own bowl already empty. Mabel placed a pot of tea on the table and sat down with them, her expression serious. "All right, McQuaid, out with it." Quietly, Jonah explained the situation, leaving out no detail: the contract, the Argent and Company, notice the signature of Silas Bixby. As he spoke, Mabel's face grew hard. "Silas Bixby," she said, the name a curse on her lips. That man would bill God for the sunshine if he could figure out how. So Argent thinks it can own a person now, same as it owns the mine and every soul in it. She looked at Eliza with a new, fierce protectiveness. "Well, he will find some of us do not scare so easy." She took a sip of her tea, her eyes thoughtful. "Still, you must be careful. Child, this town, it runs on fear and company coin. Men in this town carry guns because they are afraid of their own hearts. They are more scared of losing a day's wage than they are of losing their soul." Over the next few days, Eliza learned the truth of Mabel's words. She could not bear to be idle, to sit and wait for a fate to be decided for her. She offered her services as a tutor, putting up a small, handwritten notice on the board outside the general store. The response was hesitant at first. The miners' wives looked at her with a mixture of pity and suspicion, but the need was great. Their children were growing up wild, with no education beyond the workings of a mine shaft. A woman named Mary O'Connell was the first to hire her, offering to pay for lessons for her 2 young sons. The payment was not in dollars, but in small brass tokens, stamped with the Argent and Company crest. "It is all we get, Miss," Mary said, her voice thin with a weary resignation. "Company scrip, good only at the company store. For company prices. Mr. Bixby says it builds loyalty." The brass token felt heavy and cold in Eliza's palm. It was not a coin. It was a link in a chain. Still, she took it. She taught the O'Connell boys their letters and numbers in a corner of Mabel's common room. Her first act of self-sufficiency in this strange, hard town. Soon, other mothers followed, and the whispers grew with every lesson she gave. "That is her, the one Bixby's looking for. Argent's property, they say. Pretty thing. Shame. What will happen to her?" The words were like stones, thrown from a distance, but landing with a sharp, bruising impact. She learned to hold her head high, to meet the curious and sometimes hostile stares with a quiet dignity that was its own form of defiance. The law found her on the 4th day. He was a young man, not much older than Eliza herself, with a clean-shaven jaw and a troubled look in his eyes. The silver star pinned to his vest seemed too large and bright for him. He took off his hat as he approached her in the boarding house, his manner polite and almost apologetic. "Miss Hart, I am Deputy Tom Avery." "Yes," she said, her heart beginning to beat a little faster. "I am afraid I have some business with you. Official business." He shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable. "We received a packet from the Argent office. It contains a file from an institution in Boston, a debt contract, signed by the Mother Superior. It seems Argent and Company purchased the debt. Mr. Bixby has filed a formal claim." "A claim on what?" Deputy Mabel Crow's voice cut in. Sharp as a razor, she had appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. "On a human being." Deputy Avery flushed. "Ma'am, I am just the messenger. The circuit judge is due in 2 weeks. He will hold a hearing at the county seat in Red Willow to decide the matter. This is a civil dispute, he says, for the courts to sort out." He handed Eliza a folded piece of paper. It was a formal summons, naming her as the respondent in the matter of Hart versus Argent and Company. "I am sorry, Miss," he said, his eyes meeting hers for a brief, regretful moment before he turned and left. The next afternoon, the conflict took a more direct and ugly form. Jonah had gone to the general store for supplies, and Eliza had walked with him, needing to feel the crisp winter air. As they came out of the store, a man blocked their path. He was the town blacksmith, a burly man with arms like tree trunks and a face permanently smudged with soot. His name was Hector Darrell. He ignored Eliza, his sneering gaze fixed on Jonah. Well, if it is not the ghost of the mountain," he said, his voice a loud, carrying taunt. "Heard you came down with something more than furs this time. McQuaid." He spat a brown stream of tobacco juice near Jonah's boots. "Looks like the mountain man found himself a pretty piece of lost property and decided to keep it." The street went quiet. Men stopped what they were doing, turning to watch. Eliza felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. Jonah did not move. He did not speak. He simply looked at Hector Darrell, and the air around him grew heavy and still. There was no anger in his face, only a vast and dangerous calm, the quiet that comes before a lightning strike. The blacksmith, for all his bluster, took a half-step back, his sneer faltering. Before anything else could happen, Mabel Crow's voice sliced through the tension. She had appeared on the boardwalk of her boarding house. "Hector Darrell, you have got enough hot air in you to keep your own forge lit for a week," she called out, her hands on her hips. "Some men spend their days forging steel into useful things. Others just forge gossip because their own lives are too dull to bear looking at. Now get back to your anvil before you embarrass yourself further." Several men chuckled. The blacksmith's face turned a dark, mottled red. He shot one last venomous look at Jonah and then turned on his heel, stalking back toward his smithy. The sound of his hammer blows a few moments later, angrier and louder than usual. That evening, the summons lay on the table between Eliza and Jonah. The lamp cast long, dancing shadows on the walls. The document, with its official seals and legal phrases, felt like a cage being built around her, bar by paper bar. 2 weeks, she said, her voice barely a whisper. "What can we do in 2 weeks?" Jonah reached across the table, his large, calloused hand resting near the summons. The faded scar on his skin stood out in the lamplight. He looked at the paper, then at her, his expression unyielding. "We do not wait for fate to judge," he said, his voice the quiet, solid rumble she had first heard in the cabin, the voice that had promised gentleness and delivered strength. "We go looking for the truth." The search for truth began not in the sheriff's office or a lawyer's dusty room, but on a path leading up a small hill at the edge of town. The Hallow Creek Church was a simple wooden structure, its steeple a plain, unadorned spike against the vast, pale sky, unlike the rest of the town, which seemed to crouch under the shadow of the mine. The church stood slightly apart, as if in quiet protest. Jonah walked beside Eliza, his long strides measured to match her own. The air was still and cold, and the silence between them was not empty, but filled with a shared, unspoken purpose. He had not explained where they were going, and she had not asked. She simply trusted the direction he chose. He stopped before the church's modest wooden doors. "There is a man here, Father Patrick O'Rourke. He keeps the town's records. More importantly, he keeps its conscience." The man who greeted them inside was thin and stooped, with a fringe of white hair around a bald, freckled head and eyes that held a deep, scholarly sadness. He looked from Jonah's formidable presence to Eliza's refined, anxious face, and a flicker of understanding passed through his gaze. "Jonah," Father O'Rourke said, his voice soft, with the faint lilt of the old country. "It has been a long time since you came up this hill." "I do not come for myself, Father," Jonah replied. "We need your help. We are looking for a ghost, a legal one." They sat in the priest's small office, a room warmed by a pot-belly stove and smelling of old paper, beeswax, and weak tea. Eliza explained her situation, her voice low but steady, laying out the facts of the convent's debt and the contract that now bound her to Argent and Company. The priest listened without interruption, his hands steepled before him, his expression growing more somber with each word. When she finished, he was silent for a long moment, staring into the heart of the stove's small fire. "I know of Silas Bixby's methods," he said at last. "Some years ago, there was a dispute over labor contracts for a group of Chinese workers. They were promised a certain wage, but the company used fine print and company script to bind them into a kind of servitude. I was asked to bear witness to the original agreements. When it came to court, the documents had been altered. My testimony was not enough. The company's lawyers, with their polished shoes and silver tongues, made the truth seem like a faulty memory." He sighed, a sound of old defeat. "They use the law not as a shield for the innocent, but as a club. This contract was signed in Boston," Jonah said, "but maybe you would have some record of it. The convent sent letters, soliciting donations. Perhaps you kept them." Father O'Rourke nodded slowly. "We did. The church often served as a post office for such things. Many of the miners' wives, good women from back east, would donate what little they could to the schools and orphanages they remembered." He led them to a small alcove where several large, leather-bound ledgers were stored on a shelf. "After the fire at the paper warehouse last year, we gathered up what records we could salvage from the community. Everything is a bit of a jumble." For the next hour, they carefully paged through the brittle, yellowed documents. It was Eliza who found it. Tucked inside a ledger of baptisms was a thin sheaf of letters and donation records from her own convent school. Her heart pounded as she spread them out on the priest's desk. "Here," she said, her finger tracing a line of spidery script. "This is a list of donors from the winter of 1868, and this letter acknowledges the funds received." She paused, leaning closer. "That is strange." "What is it?" Jonah asked, his voice a low rumble beside her. "The ink," she whispered. "Look here." She pointed to a name on the donor list. A local merchant was credited with a sizable donation. The name is written over something else. The ink is darker, and it has feathered slightly, as if the paper was already disturbed. Someone has erased the original name and written this one in its place. Father O'Rourke brought a magnifying glass, and they all bent over the page, under the lens. The alteration was undeniable. Faint traces of the original letters were visible beneath the new, bolder script. "I remember this," the priest said softly. "There was talk of a large anonymous donation that winter. It was the talk of the town for a week. Then, suddenly, the talk stopped, and this merchant, a man who does a great deal of business with the Argent Company, was being praised for his generosity. It means Bixby, or someone working for him, has been planning this for a long time," Jonas said, his voice grim, controlling the narrative, making it look like the convent was being supported by his allies, perhaps to justify his later claim on its assets. Eliza felt a growing unease, the sense of being caught in a web woven long before she ever knew it existed. She was not just fighting a man. She was fighting a meticulously constructed fiction, a history that had been deliberately rewritten with smudged ink and convenient lies. She felt a wave of hopelessness, the fear that she was nothing more than a burden to this quiet, powerful man who was risking so much for her. They walked back toward the boarding house as a light snow began to fall, the flakes melting on the frozen mud of the street. The brief victory in the priest's office had faded, leaving behind the cold reality of their task. They had found a flaw, but it was a small one, a smudge against a mountain of legal documents and corporate power. Eliza pulled her cloak tighter, shivering not just from the cold. "I am sorry, Jonah," she said quietly, "to bring this trouble to you." He stopped and turned to face her. The falling snow caught in his dark beard and on the shoulders of his deerskin coat. "This is not your trouble, Eliza. It is Bixby's. He is the one who brought it here. But your life, it was peaceful. Up on the mountain." A shadow passed over his face, a pain so deep and old it seemed a part of him. He looked away from her, toward the grim silhouette of the mine's headframe on the horizon. "My life was quiet," he said, correcting her. "That is not the same as peaceful." He took a deep breath, the cold air seeming to fortify him for what he had to say next. "I was a miner once. My younger brother, Samuel, and we came west looking for a new start. We were good at it, strong backs, not afraid of the dark." He held up his left hand, turning it over in the gray light. The long, pale scar that ran across the back of it seemed to stand out against his skin. "We worked for Argent. They were always pushing for more ore. Faster, cutting corners on timbering, ignoring the signs of unstable ground. We all knew it was dangerous. But a man needs to work." His voice dropped lower, the words coming out rough and uneven. "There was a collapse. A section of the tunnel just gave way. It happened so fast. I was closer to the entrance. The blast of air threw me clear. Samuel, he was deeper in—" He closed his hand into a fist, the knuckles white. "I tried to go back. I dug with my bare hands until they were raw. This scar, a piece of shattered timber." By the time they cleared the rockfall, it was too late. He fell silent. The only sound was the soft hiss of the falling snow. Eliza felt her heart ache for him, for the boy he had been and the brother he had lost. She finally understood the source of his stillness, the deep well of sorrow he carried within him. His exile on the mountain was not just a preference, it was a penance. "The company called it an act of God," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "They gave my family a pittance, less than the value of the mules that were also lost. I saw Silas Bixby that day. He never looked me in the eye. He just talked about production delays. After that, I could not go back underground. I could not breathe the dust of that place anymore. So I went up the mountain. I went where a man's life is his own responsibility." Impulsively, she reached out, her fingers, trembling slightly from the cold and the force of his story, gently brushed the snow from the sleeve of his coat. It was a small, simple gesture of comfort, all she had to offer. She felt the hard muscle beneath the worn deerskin, the solid, living warmth of him. For a moment, their eyes met, and in his, she saw not a giant, not a mountain man, but a person laid bare by grief. He registered the touch, the tremor in her hand. And then he did something that spoke more of his character than any words could. He took a small, almost imperceptible step back. It was not a rejection. It was the opposite. It was an act of profound respect, a quiet acknowledgement of the space between them. He was giving her room, ensuring she would never feel trapped or crowded by his presence. In that small movement, he told her that he saw her, Eliza Hart, not as a woman to be claimed or protected like property, but as a person deserving of her own ground to stand on. They stood there for a long moment in the falling snow, the unspoken understanding between them a fragile, powerful thing. Later that evening, in the warm common room of the boarding house, Eliza sat with the summons and the notes she had made. The document from Argent felt different now. It was not just a legal threat. It was a weapon. forged in the same fire of greed and indifference that had taken Jonah's brother. She examined it with a new, fierce intensity, her mind sharp and clear. She read through the dense legal language again and again, her convent education forcing her to analyze every word, every punctuation mark. And then she saw it. It was a small detail, something a lawyer might overlook, something only a person familiar with the mundane details of correspondence might notice. At the bottom of the first page was an embossed seal, the official seal of a Boston notary public, meant to certify the authenticity of the signatures. It was a crisp, clear impression of an eagle clutching a bundle of arrows. But Eliza remembered the letters the convent received from their Boston benefactors. 2 years ago, the old notary, Mr. Abernathy, had passed away, and his son had taken over the practice. The son, eager to make his own mark, had commissioned a new seal, a slightly different design, with the eagle's head turned to the left instead of the right. The seal on this document was the new one. She felt a jolt, a surge of pure, electrifying hope. "Jonah," she said, her voice sharp with excitement. He looked up from the knife he was sharpening by the fire. "The date on this contract," she said, her hands shaking as she pointed to the paper. "It is dated 3 years ago, but this seal, the notary who uses it only began his practice 2 years ago. It was not even made on the day this paper claims it was signed." Jonah put down his knife and came to the table. He looked at the seal, then at the date, and then at her. The weariness in his eyes was gone, replaced by a sharp, focused glint. The ghost they had been hunting finally had a face. The lie had a fatal flaw. "Bixby got sloppy," Jonah said, a slow, grim smile touching his lips for the first time. "He built his cage, but he used the wrong kind of lock." A week before the hearing, Argent and Company draped Hallow Creek in bunting and false cheer. Lanterns were strung across the muddy street, casting a festive golden glow that failed to hide the town's grim realities. A banjo and fiddle duo were brought in from a neighboring county, their lively tunes echoing off the false-fronted buildings with a hollow vibrancy. The company was hosting a town ball in the newly constructed warehouse, an event Bixby promoted as a celebration of their shared prosperity and a chance to attract new investors for a planned expansion. To Eliza, it felt like a public staging for her own humiliation. "I cannot go," she told Mabel, looking at the invitation that had been delivered to every door, a pristine white card that felt like an extension of the summons. "You must," Mabel said, her hands busy kneading dough on a floured board. "If you hide, you let Bixby tell your story for you. You will walk in there, on Jonah's arm. With your head held high, you will show them you are not a piece of property. You are a lady, and you will wear my good blue dress." The dress was of a fine, dark wool with a modest lace collar. When Eliza put it on, she saw in the boarding house's small, wavy mirror a glimpse of the Boston girl she had been, but with a new strength in her eyes that had not been there before. Jonah stood waiting for her at the bottom of the stairs, looking profoundly uncomfortable. He had traded his deerskins for a borrowed dark coat and trousers. The formal clothes seemed to constrain him, to cage the wild, quiet energy that was so much a part of him. He looked less like a mountain man and more like the mountain itself, forced into a suit of clothes. He did not smile when he saw her, but his eyes softened, a silent acknowledgement that was more meaningful than any compliment. The warehouse was cavernous and loud, filled with the mingled scents of sawdust, cheap whiskey, and the damp wool of coats. The entire town was there, the miners and their wives in their Sunday best, their face scrubbed clean, their expressions a mixture of forced merriment and deep-seated weariness. At one end of the room, on a raised platform, sat Silas Bixby, holding court like a king. He was impeccably dressed in a tailored Eastern suit, a silk vest, and a polished gold watch chain gleaming on his waistcoat. He laughed and poured drinks, a picture of benevolent authority, his eyes scanning the crowd with a predator's constant vigilance. When he saw them enter, a slow, satisfied smile spread across his face. He had gotten what he wanted. His prize was on display. For the first hour, they were left alone. An isolated island in the sea of forced celebration. People would glance their way, then look away quickly, as if afraid to be caught showing any allegiance. They danced a single, stilted waltz, Jonah's large hand resting gently on Eliza's waist, his movements careful and deliberate, as if he were afraid he might break her. Eliza focused on the solid strength of him, the anchor he provided in this churning, hostile sea. Then Bixby made his move. He stepped to the center of the platform and tapped a spoon against a glass, the clear, ringing sound cutting through the chatter and the music. The room fell silent. All eyes turned to him. "Friends, neighbors," he began, his voice smooth and carrying, the voice of a man accustomed to being heard. "Thank you for joining us tonight to celebrate the bright future of Hallow Creek, a future we at Argent & Company are proud to build with you." There was a smattering of polite applause. Bixby let it die down, his gaze sweeping the room until it landed, with theatrical precision, on Eliza. "Prosperity is not just about the ore we pull from the ground," he continued, his tone shifting to one of mock sympathy. "It is about promises. The promises we make to our investors, to our workers, and the promises we make in our own lives. It is about honoring our commitments." He raised his glass, and though he spoke to the whole room, his words were aimed like arrows directly at her. "And speaking of promises, it seems we have a guest tonight who knows a thing or two about them." A low murmur rippled through the crowd. Jonah's hand, which was resting on the back of Eliza's chair, tensed. "A young lady of quality, raised in the finest traditions of the East," Bixby said, his voice dripping with condescension. He took a deliberate step forward on the stage, his smile a mask of false sincerity. She was promised the East's finest silk gowns, society balls, a place of honor and security in a civilized world, a truly splendid future. He paused, letting the words hang in the air, letting the miners and their wives imagine the life she had supposedly thrown away. He then gestured with his glass toward Jonah, a flick of the wrist that was a masterpiece of dismissal. "But it seems her future now lies beneath the western sky, with a fur trapper and deerskins." The question was an insult wrapped in a joke, and a current of cruel laughter ran through a portion of the crowd. They were laughing at her, at Jonah, at the sheer absurdity of choosing this hard, gritty life over the one Bixby had painted. Eliza felt a hot flush of shame, but then she looked at Jonah. He was watching Bixby, his face impassive, his stillness more potent than any outburst. He was not ashamed, and in that moment, she decided she would not be either. She stood up. Her movement was calm, unhurried. The room quieted again, surprised by her audacity. She looked directly at Silas Bixby, her voice not loud but clear and sharp enough to cut through the heavy air of the warehouse. "My future," she said, "is not written on a bill of debt." A collective intake of breath. The simplicity and directness of her reply disarmed the crowd's mockery. It was not the tearful denial or angry outburst Bixby had clearly hoped to provoke. It was a statement of fact, delivered with a quiet, unshakable dignity. Bixby's smile tightened at the edges. His public performance had been upstaged. Frustrated, his eyes darted through the crowd and found Hector Darrell, the blacksmith, who was standing near the whiskey barrel, his face already flushed with drink. Bixby gave him a subtle, almost imperceptible nod. Hector, seeing his cue, pushed his way forward. "A bill of debt is a promise," he shouted, his voice slurred. He pointed a thick finger at Jonah. "And what do you know of promises? McQuaid, hiding up on your mountain while honest men work. You come down here and steal what is not yours." Jonah did not even turn to look at him. His eyes remained fixed on Bixby, the true source of the attack. "I am talking to you," Hector bellowed, stepping closer and shoving Jonah's shoulder. It was like shoving a granite boulder. Jonah did not move, did not even seem to register the blacksmith's touch. "That is enough. Hector," a new voice said. Deputy Tom Avery had materialized from the crowd, his young face set with a weary determination. He placed a hand on the blacksmith's chest. "He needs to be taught a lesson," Hector snarled. "The only lesson you need tonight is how to find your way home," Avery said, his voice firm. He pushed the blacksmith back a step. "This is a town dance, not a company courtroom. Go cool your head." He then looked past Hector, his gaze meeting Bixby's for a long, challenging moment. The deputy's eyes were clear, and in them, Bixby could read a dawning suspicion, a warning that the law might not be as pliable as he had assumed. Hector Darrell, seeing he had lost his patron's support for the moment, grumbled and allowed himself to be led away. The festive atmosphere of the ball was shattered. The music did not resume. People began to talk in low, urgent whispers, grabbing their coats. The spectacle was over. As Eliza and Jonah turned to leave, Mabel Crow intercepted them near the door. Her face was pale, and she clutched a folded letter in her hand. "Jonah, Eliza, thank God," she breathed, her usual sharp wit gone, replaced by a nervous energy. "This just came. A rider on his way to the next county brought it. He said a woman pressed it into his hand back east, made him swear to deliver it to the church here." She thrust the letter at Jonah. "It is from a sister, Mary Catherine. I knew her years ago, before she took her vows. She was at that convent with you, Eliza." They hurried back to the quiet solitude of the boarding house. In the warm lamplight of the common room, Jonah broke the wax seal. The handwriting inside was shaky, the script of an elderly hand. He began to read aloud, his deep voice filling the silent room. The letter spoke of the convent's desperate financial state, of the Mother Superior's failing health and judgment, but it was the final paragraph that made the air grow cold. "I must confess a sin of omission," Jonah read, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "I was privy to the discussions regarding Eliza's contract. The document was prepared, but Mother Superior hesitated, her conscience troubled, before she could be persuaded to sign it. Our dear Sister Anne, who managed the convent's accounts, took ill. The consumption moved swiftly. Sister Anne passed into the arms of the Lord on the 10th of April. Jonah stopped reading. He looked at Eliza, his eyes wide with the terrible significance of what he was about to say. He looked down at the summons still lying on the table. "Eliza," he said slowly, "what is the date on Bixby's contract?" She did not have to look. The date was burned into her memory. "The 15th of June," she whispered. He finished the letter's last sentence. "The signature on that contract, purporting to be that of Sister Anne, is a forgery. It was signed 2 months after she was laid to rest in the convent cemetery." Silence. The clock on the mantel ticked, each sound a hammer blow marking the passage of time. The smudged ink, the incorrect seal, those were mistakes. This was proof. This was a lie dug up from a grave. They were not just fighting a contract anymore. They were fighting a crime. And for the first time, they had a weapon sharp enough to draw blood. The letter from Sister Mary Catherine changed everything. It transformed their small, flickering hope into a steady, burning flame. They had to get the letter, along with their other evidence, to the circuit judge in Red Willow, the county seat. A 2-day ride through the treacherous high passes. With the hearing less than a week away, there was no time to lose. Deputy Tom Avery insisted on escorting them. "This is not just a civil matter anymore," he said, his young face grim with a resolve that made him seem older. "Forgery, coercion, these are serious crimes. It is my duty to see that this evidence, and you, arrive safely." They left at dawn. A small, determined party of 3 against the vast, indifferent wilderness. Eliza rode a steady mare borrowed from the livery, the precious letters sealed in an oilskin pouch and tucked deep inside her coat. Jonah, mounted on a powerful roan, looked once more at home, his deerskins replacing the stiff suit, his rifle resting in a saddle scabbard. He rode slightly ahead, his eyes constantly scanning the trail. reading the landscape like a language she was only just beginning to understand. For the first day, the weather held. The sky was a high crystalline blue, and the sun on the snow was dazzling. But as they began their ascent into the higher passes on the second morning, the world began to change. The blue sky became veiled in a thin, milky haze. The air grew heavy and still, carrying a strange, metallic scent. A profound silence fell over the mountains, the kind of quiet that precedes violence. "A late storm," Jonah said, his voice low and serious as he reined in his horse, looking at the ominous gray bank of clouds massing on the western horizon. "A bad one. We need to push on. There is an old way station on the other side of this pass. We might just beat it." They urged their horses onward, the pace now urgent. The wind began to pick up. A low moan at first, then a high, cutting shriek that drove pellets of ice and snow before it. The world dissolved into a gray, swirling chaos. Visibility dropped to a few dozen feet. The trail became a treacherous memory, hidden beneath a fresh, rapidly deepening layer of snow. They came to it without warning. A deep, rocky gorge carved by a churning, ice-choked creek. A rickety wooden bridge, swaying in the wind, was their only way across. As Jonah's horse set a tentative hoof on the frost-slicked planks, there was a sound like a pistol shot the sharp crack of stressed timber. It was followed by a deep, groaning roar as the main support beam on the far side splintered and gave way. With a sickening lurch, half the bridge tore away from the cliff and plunged into the torrent below, leaving a jagged, impassable chasm. Eliza's mare, terrified by the sound and the sudden collapse, reared violently. Eliza, caught off guard, lost her grip and was thrown from the saddle. She landed hard on the remaining section of the bridge, the impact knocking the wind from her lungs. She slid on the icy planks, her momentum carrying her toward the newly opened abyss. Her fingers scrabbled for purchase, finding only splintered, frozen wood. Her legs dangled over the edge, the furious, hungry roar of the creek filling her ears. "Eliza!" Jonah's shout was a raw, desperate sound, torn from his throat. In a heartbeat, he was off his horse, a coil of rope already in his hand. He moved with a speed and certainty that defied the treacherous footing. He threw the end of the rope to Avery. "Tie it to that pine and hold it fast." As Avery scrambled to secure the lifeline, Jonah, without hesitation, worked his way onto the tilting, unstable remains of the bridge. It swayed sickeningly under his weight. He lay flat, distributing his weight as best he could, his powerful hands gripping the icy planks, and edged his way toward her. The wind tore at him, trying to pry him from his hold. Eliza could feel her grip failing. The cold had made her fingers numb and clumsy. She looked down at the churning, gray water and then up at Jonah. His face was a mask of fierce concentration, but in his eyes, she saw a terror that mirrored her own. It was the fear of a man watching a nightmare repeat itself, the fear of losing someone to the unforgiving cruelty of a collapse. He was not just saving her, he was fighting the ghosts of the mineshaft that had haunted him for years. "Hold on, Eliza," he said, his voice a low, steady anchor in the screaming wind. "Just hold on. I have got you." He reached her, his large, gloved hand closing around her wrist with a strength that was both absolute and incredibly gentle. "Let go of the bridge," he commanded. "Trust the rope. Trust me." She did. She let her numb fingers uncurl, and for a terrifying second, she was held over the abyss by his strength alone, with a powerful, fluid motion. He pulled her back onto the solid part of the bridge, shielding her body with his own as loose rocks and ice fell from the cliff face above. Avery, pulling on the rope from the bank, helped them inch their way back to the relative safety of the trail. They collapsed onto the snowy ground, gasping for air, the adrenaline leaving them shaken and weak. And it was then that they heard the sound of approaching horses. Through the swirling snow, a group of riders emerged. At their head, sitting on a fine black stallion, was Silas Bixby. He was flanked by several hard-faced men, including the blacksmith, Hector Darrell. Bixby reined in his horse, a look of calculated concern on his face. Miss Hart, a fortunate meeting. It seems you have run into some trouble. His eyes flickered over the broken bridge, then to her, then to Jonah. This pass is no place for a lady, especially in such weather and with such uncertain company. He dismounted, his expensive leather boots sinking into the snow. I was on my way to Red Willow myself to prepare for our little legal misunderstanding. When I heard you had left town, I became concerned for your welfare. Allow me to offer you my protection. We do not need your protection, Jonah said, getting to his feet and placing himself between Bixby and Eliza. Bixby ignored him, his focus entirely on Eliza. He gave her a charming, condescending smile. My offer is a simple one. Come with me. You will be my guest at my home in Red Willow until the hearing. You will have a warm room, good food, the care of my housekeeper. We can avoid all this unpleasantness. In exchange for what? Eliza asked, her voice steady despite the tremor in her limbs. A simple document, Bixby said smoothly. An agreement to remain silent on this matter until the judge can hear the facts in an orderly fashion. It will prevent any more public displays. It is for your own good, to protect your reputation. The offer was a silken trap. He was offering to save her from a danger he himself had created, to buy her silence and isolate her from Jonah and her evidence. He was not offering protection. He was offering a gilded cage. Eliza got to her feet, brushing the snow from her coat. She looked him directly in the eye, her fear burned away by a cold, clear anger. You are not afraid of the storm. Mr. Bixby, she said, her voice ringing with conviction. You are afraid of the truth. Bixby's smile vanished, replaced by a flash of cold fury. Before he could respond, a loud crack echoed from the trees above them. A massive pine branch, heavy with snow and weakened by the wind, broke free and came crashing down. There were shouts of alarm as the riders scattered. Hector Darrell, slower to react, was directly in its path. He threw up an arm as the branch struck him, a sickening crunch of bone echoing in the sudden silence. He went down hard, his leg bent at an unnatural angle beneath the weight of the branch. Bixby looked at the injured man with cold annoyance. Fool, he muttered. He turned to one of his other men. Get that off him. If he can ride, he rides. If not, we leave him. We are losing the light. Jonah watched the scene, his face set like stone. He saw Bixby's callous disregard, the man's willingness to discard a loyal follower like a broken tool. He looked at Hector, groaning in the snow, and then back at Bixby, who was already turning his horse to leave. In that moment, a choice was made. Without a word, Jonah walked over to the fallen branch. With a grunt of effort, he lifted the immense weight, enough for Avery to drag the injured blacksmith clear. Hector's face was pale and slick with sweat, his leg clearly broken. We cannot leave him, Avery said, looking at Bixby with open disgust. He is not our concern, Bixby snapped. Stay with him if you want, deputy. But Miss Hart is coming with me. No, Jonah said. The word was not a shout, but it carried the weight of the mountain behind it. He walked over and, with surprising gentleness, he lifted Hector Darrell into his arms, the big blacksmith groaning in pain, cradling the injured man as if he weighed nothing. Jonah started walking back the way they had come, his boots sinking deep into the snow with each determined step. He was not just rescuing a man, he was making a statement. He was choosing compassion over cruelty, community over self-interest. Bixby watched him go, momentarily speechless. He had lost control of the situation. To force a confrontation now, to try and take Eliza by force, would look monstrous, even to his own men. With a curse, he spun his horse around and rode off into the storm, his men following, leaving them behind. They found shelter as twilight faded into a deep, stormy darkness, an abandoned stable, half buried in a snowdrift. Avery managed to get the horses inside while Jonah laid Hector gently on a bed of old hay. Eliza, her hands shaking, used strips of her own petticoat to help Jonah splint the blacksmith's leg with pieces of a broken stall door. They built a small, smoky fire in the center of the earthen floor. The wind howled outside, but inside their small haven, there was a profound quiet. Hector had passed out from the pain. Avery was tending to the horses. Eliza and Jonah sat by the fire, the flickering light playing on their exhausted faces. He had a long, shallow cut on his cheek from a piece of flying ice. She tore another strip from her petticoat, dipped it in melted snow, and gently cleaned the wound. His skin was cold to the touch, but beneath it, she felt the steady, living warmth of him. He did not pull away. He simply watched her, his eyes full of a quiet, wondering gratitude. They did not speak. There were no words for what had passed between them on the mountain. The terror, the trust, the shared defiance. They had been tested by the storm and by the ugliness of men, and they had not broken. They huddled together by the small fire, two survivors sharing a small circle of warmth, listening to the wind rage against the walls, safe for now, together in the heart of the storm. The county seat of Red Willow was little more than a wide spot in the road with a courthouse that was, in reality, a large, hastily constructed wooden hall that smelled of green timber and damp wool. On the day of the hearing, it was packed to the rafters. Miners stood along the back wall, their faces clean for once, their expressions grim and watchful. Town merchants, their wives, and even Father O'Rourke sat on the hard wooden benches. It felt less like a legal proceeding and more like a town holding its breath, waiting to see if the air it was allowed to breathe belonged to itself or to Argent and Company. At the front of the room, behind a simple pine table, sat Judge Alistair Blackwood. He was a traveling circuit judge, an older man with a deeply lined face and eyes that had seen too much of the raw, often brutal, nature of frontier justice. He looked tired, but his gaze was sharp and missed nothing. Silas Bixby sat at a table to the right, flanked by a slick, well-dressed lawyer from back east named Mr. Finch. Bixby looked calm, confident, a man entirely certain of the outcome. Eliza and Jonah sat at a table to the left. Jonah was a silent, solid presence beside her, his sheer size a quiet statement of protection. He had said little that morning, but when she had looked at him, his eyes had conveyed a simple, unwavering message. You are not alone. Judge Blackwood banged a wooden gavel. This court is now in session. We are here to hear the civil matter of Argent and Company versus Eliza Hart concerning a contractual obligation of service. Mr. Finch, you may begin. Mr. Finch rose, a smug, self-assured smile on his face. He spoke in a smooth, eloquent baritone, his words flowing like oiled machinery. He spoke of the sanctity of contracts, the bedrock of commerce and civilization. He painted a picture of a benevolent convent, saved from ruin by the timely generosity of Argent and Company. He spoke of tradition and custom, the duty of a ward to honor the agreements made by her guardians. This is not a matter of feelings, Your Honor, he said, gesturing toward Eliza with a dismissive wave. It is a matter of law. Miss Hart, in her youthful impetuousness, has chosen to disregard a solemn, legally binding agreement. She has broken a promise. Argent and Company does not seek to punish her. It seeks merely to have the terms of the agreement, an agreement that saved her childhood home from destitution. Honored, it is a simple matter of property and obligation. When he sat down, a murmur of assent went through the benches where the company men were sitting. The case sounded simple, irrefutable. Miss Hart, the judge said, his voice neutral. You have no legal counsel. Do you wish to speak for yourself? Eliza stood, her heart hammering against her ribs. She smoothed the front of her simple wool dress and took a deep breath. She looked not at the lawyer, but at the judge. Your Honor, she began, her voice clearer and stronger than she had expected. Mr. Finch speaks of promises, I wish to speak of truths. He claims this is a matter of property. I stand before you to prove that I am a person, and that the document he holds is not a promise, but a carefully constructed falsehood. She laid her small collection of papers on the table. First, I submit the contract itself. Mr. Finch calls it a solemn agreement. I call it a forgery. She explained the matter of the notary seal, the discrepancy in the dates, showing how the seal could not have existed on the day the contract was supposedly signed. Finch jumped to his feet. Objection, circumstantial speculation, a simple clerical error, at worst. Overruled. The judge said. His eyes narrowed with interest. Continue, Miss Hart. Second, Eliza said, her confidence growing. I offer this page from a church ledger, showing a list of donors to the convent. As you can see, the name of the primary benefactor has been erased and rewritten. This shows a pattern of deception, an attempt to alter the history of the convent's finances to support a future claim. Finally, she picked up the letter from Sister Mary Catherine. And last, Your Honor, I offer this testimony, a letter from a woman who was there, a woman who testifies under the eyes of God that the person whose signature is on this contract, Sister Anne, was in her grave for 2 months before this document was ever signed. She read the final paragraph of the letter aloud. A stunned silence fell over the courtroom. The miners at the back of the room looked at each other, their expressions hardening. This was not the law. This was grave robbery. Finch was on his feet again, his face flushed. Hearsay. The ramblings of an old woman. This letter is inadmissible, a desperate attempt to slander a reputable company. The judge held up a hand. The letter's origin is noted. Mr. Finch, I will take it under advisement. He looked weary, caught between the clear evidence of fraud and the immense pressure exerted by the company that owned the county. It was at that moment that the doors at the back of the courtroom creaked open. A ripple of surprise went through the crowd. Hector Darrell, the blacksmith, stood in the doorway, leaning heavily on a pair of rough-hewn crutches. His leg was in a thick splint. His face was pale, but his eyes burned with a fire Eliza had never seen before. He began to make his slow, painful way down the central aisle. I have something to say, he called out, his voice hoarse but carrying through the room. This is highly irregular, Finch protested. Let him approach, the judge said, his gaze fixed on the injured blacksmith. Hector reached the front of the room and turned to face the judge, refusing to look at Silas Bixby. Your Honor, he said, his breath coming in ragged bursts. My name is Hector Darrell. I am the blacksmith in Hollow Creek, and I am a perjurer and a fraud. A collective gasp went through the room. Bixby's face, for the first time, lost its composure. A muscle twitched in his jaw. I want to tell you about shipping manifests, Hector said, his voice growing stronger. About how a man can be hired to create false records, how you can take a stamp and a bit of ink and make it look like 100 barrels of flour were delivered when they were not. How you can create a paper trail of expenses to make it seem like a company is spending more money than it is, to hide profits or, in this case, to make it seem like a charitable fund was empty when it was actually full. He finally turned and pointed a trembling finger at Bixby. That man, Silas Bixby, he paid me to create false manifests for the company store, to help him hide the fact that the donations sent to that convent in Boston, the money sent by the good women of this town, had already paid off the debt twice over. He needed the debt to exist on paper, so he could use this contract to claim her. His voice broke on the last word. He told me it was just business, but then I saw that man. He nodded toward Jonah. Carry me through a blizzard when his own boss would have left me to die, and I understood that some things are more important than business. Bixby shot to his feet. This is an outrage, the ravings of a disgruntled employee. But his words were drowned out by the scraping of another chair. Deputy Tom Avery walked to the judge's table, a heavy tax ledger in his hands. He did not look at Bixby. He addressed the judge. "Your Honor, in light of Mr. Darrell's testimony, I wish to submit the official tax ledgers for Hollow Creek for the past 5 years. They show a record of a special fund, managed by the church, for the specific purpose of remitting donations to the Boston convent. The records show, with receipts, that the fund had reached a surplus sufficient to clear the convent's stated debt in the autumn of 1868. Several months before Miss Hart's contract was supposedly created, there was no debt. The entire transaction was fraudulent from its inception." The room erupted. The evidence was no longer a single thread, but a thick, unbreakable rope. The forgery, the testimony, the official town records, they all pointed to the same ugly truth. Judge Blackwood slammed his gavel again and again, calling for order. When the room finally quieted, he looked at Silas Bixby. The judge's face was no longer weary. It was cold with the fire of righteous anger. "Mr. Bixby," he said, his voice like the crack of ice, "this court has heard enough." He stood, his full height seeming to fill the room. "In the matter of Argent and Company versus Eliza Hart, this court finds that the contract in question is a product of criminal fraud, forgery, and conspiracy. It is therefore null, void, and utterly without merit. Miss Hart is, and has always been, a free woman, beholden to no one." A roar of approval went up from the miners and townspeople. Eliza felt tears well in her eyes, tears of profound, bone-deep relief. Jonah's hand found hers under the table and squeezed it gently. But the judge was not finished. He pointed his gavel at Bixby. "Furthermore, the testimony heard today suggests a pattern of criminal activity that goes far beyond the jurisdiction of this circuit court. I am therefore referring this entire case, along with all submitted evidence, to the federal district attorney for a full investigation into the business practices of Argent and Company." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "And effective immediately, by the authority vested in me by this county, the operating charter for Argent and Company in Hollow Creek is temporarily suspended, pending the outcome of that investigation." The noise in the room was deafening now. A joyous, cathartic explosion of sound. For the first time, the people of Hollow Creek had seen the company's power break against the simple, unmovable rock of the truth. Amid the chaos, Eliza looked at Silas Bixby. He was not shouting. He was not protesting. He simply stood there, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, his face a dark, thunderous mask of pure, unadulterated fury. He had been beaten, not by a lawyer, but by a quiet girl, a mountain man, a conscience-stricken blacksmith, and a lawman who chose his duty over his employer. His empire of paper and fear had crumbled around him. The return to Hollow Creek was a journey through a landscape of changed faces. The whispers that had followed Eliza down the main street were gone, replaced by a quiet, awkward deference. Men who had once stared at her with open suspicion now tipped their hats and looked at the ground. The women, who had gossiped in hushed tones, now offered shy, hesitant smiles. The town was ashamed of itself, and in its shame, it found a new and fragile kind of decency. Mabel Crow declared that justice was a dish best served hot and to as many people as possible. She slaughtered her finest steer and put 2 enormous cast-iron pots of beef stew on to simmer in the yard behind the boarding house. She sent word that any soul in Hollow Creek with an empty belly was welcome to a bowl. It was not a celebration of victory, but an act of communal healing. The entire town seemed to turn out. They came not with boisterous cheer, but with a quiet, somber gratitude. They ate from tin plates and wooden bowls, standing in small, murmuring groups. Eliza saw Mary O'Connell, who came over and pressed a small, intricately carved wooden bird into her hand. "For being brave for all of us," she whispered, and then hurried away before Eliza could respond. Hector Darrell was there, propped against the wall of the boarding house on his crutches. He did not speak to anyone for a long time, simply accepting the bowl of stew Mabel brought him. People gave him a wide berth, not out of animosity, but uncertainty. He had been one of Bixby's men, but he had also been the key to their liberation. He was a man caught between his past and his future. Later, Eliza saw him talking quietly with Father O'Rourke, and the priest placed a comforting hand on the blacksmith's shoulder. Jonah stood near the fire, a silent, watchful guardian. He was uncomfortable in the crowd, yet he remained, understanding that his presence was part of the town's reconciliation. He was no longer the ghost of the mountain. He was the man who had stood with them. Deputy Tom Avery, his silver star seeming to shine a little brighter, came and stood with them for a moment. "I had a talk with the territorial marshal," he said quietly. "He wanted to know why I had acted without his direct orders. I told him I was following the law, not a company's payroll." Avery looked out at the gathering, at the faces of the people he had sworn to protect. "I told him that if he had a problem with that, he could have my badge. I have not heard back yet." He offered a small, weary smile. "Either way, I think I will sleep better tonight." Mabel bustled over, wiping her hands on her apron. "Of course you will," she said, her voice full of gravelly affection. "A clear conscience is softer than any feather pillow." She looked at the simmering pot of stew and then at the crowd. "And it seems justice tastes better when you serve it with fresh bread." Later that afternoon, as the crowd began to thin, Hector Darrell hobbled over to where Jonah and Eliza were standing. He looked at the ground, then at his splinted leg. Then finally, he met Jonah's eyes. "McQuaid," he said, his voice rough, "I have no right to ask, but I need to get back to my smithy, to see what needs doing." Without a word, Jonah moved to his side, offering his own powerful frame as a support. He helped the blacksmith make his slow, painful way across the street. When they returned, Hector spoke to them both. "The bridge, the one that went out in the pass, soon as this leg will hold me, I am going to fix it, on my own time, with my own steel. A town needs a bridge that is stronger than the men who build it." It was the only apology he could offer, an act of atonement to be forged in his own fire. As the sun began to dip behind the high peaks, casting long, purple shadows across the valley, a quiet settled over the town. The feast was over. The dust had settled. Eliza looked up at the darkening sky, the first stars beginning to appear like diamond dust on blue velvet. She thought of Jonah's small, solitary cabin, of the profound peace of the high wilderness. "It is time to go home," she said, not to Jonah, but to herself. He heard her. He looked at her, and in his eyes, she saw the same longing for the quiet and the clean air. The journey back up the mountain was the opposite of their descent. They were not fleeing a storm, but seeking a sanctuary. When they reached the clearing where his cabin stood, a sense of profound peace washed over Eliza. The small, rough-hewn building was no longer just a stranger's shelter. It was the one place in the world she felt truly safe. The next morning, she awoke to the sound of a rhythmic chopping. She looked out the small window and saw Jonah near the edge of the woods. He was not chopping firewood. He had a small, slender pine sapling, its root ball wrapped carefully in burlap. With a spade, he was carefully digging a hole in the ground a short distance from the cabin's front door. She pulled on a warm coat and went out to join him. The air was crisp and cold, smelling of pine and damp earth. He did not seem surprised to see her. He gestured to the small tree. "Every home needs a tree," he said simply. "Something to mark the seasons, something to watch grow." He gently placed the sapling into the hole, and together they pushed the dark, rich earth back around its roots. They packed the soil down with their hands, their fingers brushing in the cold dirt. It was a shared, silent promise, a planting of roots in the stubborn mountain soil. They stood and looked at their work. The small, brave tree, a fragile splash of green against the lingering snow. That evening, they sat on the small bench outside the cabin door, wrapped in warm blankets, watching the last vestiges of daylight bleed from the sky. The great, silent expanse of the Sierra Nevada spread out before them, the peaks glowing with a soft, alpenglow pink. Jonah was quiet for a long time, his gaze lost in the distance. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low, thoughtful rumble, as if the words were being carefully excavated from a great depth. "When I first saw you," he began, standing in my doorway, covered in snow, "you said I was big enough to break you." He turned to look at her, and in the faint starlight, she could see the profound seriousness in his eyes. "I have thought about that a lot, what it means to have strength. In the mine, strength was for breaking rock, for taking from the earth. Up here, I have learned that true strength is for holding things together, for being gentle." He took her hand, his large, calloused palm enveloping her own. His touch was warm and sure. "I cannot offer you what that man Bixby spoke of. I have no silk gowns or fancy parlors. I cannot promise you a life of ease." He paused, choosing his next words with the utmost care. "All I can promise is a warm cabin and a hand that will always be gentle." The humility and honesty of his words touched her more deeply than any poet's verse could have. This was the truth of him, solid and real as the mountain beneath their feet. He stood up and pulled her gently to her feet, so they were standing before the vast, star-dusted canopy of the sky. The Milky Way was a shimmering, silver river flowing through the heart of the heavens. "They told you that you were promised the East's finest," he said, his voice thick with emotion. He gestured to the magnificent, silent spectacle above and around them. "All I have is this sky, and a heart that knows how to be careful with things that matter." He did not ask a question. He made a statement, an offering of all that he was, all that he had. Eliza looked from his earnest, open face to the boundless, breathtaking freedom of the western sky. She thought of the gilded cage that had been promised her, and of the wild, beautiful, and sometimes dangerous liberty she had found here. She thought of this man's quiet strength, his profound decency, his gentle hands. "I choose this sky," she whispered. A slow smile spread across his face, a smile that reached his eyes and lit them from within. He did not kiss her. He simply held her hand, a shared look of profound understanding passing between them. After a long, perfect silence, Eliza spoke again, her voice full of a new, quiet authority, the voice of a woman who was a partner in the building of her own future. "I will," she said, a soft smile touching her lips. "I accept, but on one condition." He looked at her, his expression curious. "We wait for spring," she said. "We wait for the ground to thaw completely, and then we will build the foundation for our home, together. A foundation has to be set right if it is going to last." He looked at her strength, her wisdom, and his love for her deepened into a kind of awe. She was not just accepting his promise, she was adding her own. He nodded, a single, solemn gesture of agreement. They would wait for the spring. They would build it right, together. Spring arrived not as a gentle guest, but as a powerful, undeniable force. It came in the roar of the creeks as they swelled with melting snow, in the deep, resonant dripping from the eaves of the cabin, and in the sweet, cold scent of thawing earth. The great white silence of winter gave way to a world of sound and color. Patches of vibrant green appeared on the forest floor, and the small pine sapling Jonah had planted stood a little taller, its needles a brighter shade in the strengthening sun, as they had promised each other. They waited until the ground was soft and workable, and then they began the foundation of their home. It was not an expansion of the trapper's cabin, but a new start. On a piece of ground Jonah had cleared a little higher up the slope, with a wider view of the valley below. The work was slow and hard. They dug into the rocky soil together, clearing stones and setting the foundation rocks one by one. Eliza found a strength in her arms and back she had never known, a deep satisfaction in the ache of her muscles at the end of the day. Jonah worked with a quiet, focused joy, his movements sure and powerful. They were not just building a house, they were building a shared future, stone by patient stone. Down in Hallow Creek, the thaw was more than just physical. The suspension of the Argent mine had been a shock, followed by a period of deep uncertainty. But, as the weeks passed, a new spirit began to take hold. Men who had only ever worked for a company wage began to prospect their own small claims. Hector Darrell, his leg now healing in a sturdy brace, fired up his forge and found he was busier than ever, sharpening tools and shoeing horses for men who were now their own masters. One Saturday, Father O'Rourke announced a community garden day. The idea was simple: to turn the fallow patch of land behind the church into a vegetable garden that would belong to everyone. A hedge against the lean times that were sure to come as the town found its new footing. When Jonah and Eliza came down from the mountain for the event, they were met with a sight that would have been unimaginable just a few months prior. The entire town was there. Men, women, and children worked side by side, turning over the soil, building raised beds, and planting rows of seeds. Even those who had once been the loudest of Bixby's supporters were there, their heads bent to the task, their shared labor a silent act of contrition. Eliza found her place naturally. The children of the town flocked to her, and she gathered them under the shade of a large oak tree, organizing a game of tag before settling them down to practice their letters. Drawing the alphabet in the soft dirt with a stick, she was no longer the outsider, the disputed property. She was their teacher. Jonah did not join the digging. He had brought a load of freshly planed timber down from his small mill on the mountain, with a quiet efficiency that drew a small crowd of admiring onlookers. He began to construct a new bed frame. It was a beautiful piece of work, strong and simple, made of golden pine. Everyone knew it was for the new house he was building, a wedding bed. His work was not for the community garden, but for the community's newest family, a public declaration of his intent, his commitment to building a life here. Mabel Crow, directing the planting with the authority of a field marshal, came over with 2 cups of cool water. She watched Jonah work for a moment, then looked over at Eliza with the children. "Quite a change from the winter," she said to Jonah, a rare note of softness in her gruff voice. "Spring has a way of doing that," he replied, not looking up from his work. "Speaking of change," Mabel said, lowering her voice, "word came down the wire. The federal marshals have been all over Argent's books. They are pulling out of the territory altogether, selling the mine for scrap." She took a sip of water. "And Silas Bixby, he is facing a federal grand jury for fraud, conspiracy, and a list of other things as long as my arm. Seems he built his entire career on bad paper." The news was a final, quiet closing of a dark chapter. Bixby was no longer a shadow looming over them. He was a problem for other people, in another place. His power in Hollow Creek had vanished as completely as the winter snow. Their wedding took place on a warm afternoon in late May. It was not in the church, but in the newly thriving garden behind it. The rows of young green shoots were their witnesses. Father O'Rourke officiated, his kind, sad eyes filled with a gentle joy. Eliza wore a simple cream-colored dress that Mabel had helped her sew, and in her hair, she wore a small crown of wild bluebells she and Jonah had picked on the mountain that morning. There was no grand feast, only a long table laden with food brought by the townspeople. Mabel had baked a magnificent 3-tiered cake, slightly lopsided but glorious in its imperfection. The banjo and fiddle players from the company ball had been rehired, and this time their music sounded not hollow, but full of a genuine foot-stomping mirth. After the simple ceremony, Jonah led Eliza in their first dance. It was a clumsy, heartfelt waltz, performed on the uneven ground between the rows of beans and corn. Jonah's large boots were careful not to crush the young plants, and he held Eliza as if she were the most precious thing in the world, his expression a mixture of profound love and intense concentration. The townspeople clapped and cheered, their faces shining with an honest, unforced happiness. It was a celebration not just of a marriage, but of a community that had found its heart again. That night, long after the last of their guests had departed, they sat together on the wooden steps of Jonah's old cabin, The foundation of their new home was a dark, solid rectangle on the hill above them, a promise waiting to be fulfilled. The air was cool and smelled of pine and wood smoke and the lingering sweetness of Mabel's cake. Above them, the sky was a breathtaking spectacle of stars, a deep and endless canopy of light. They sat in a comfortable silence, their shoulders touching, watching the great, slow wheel of the heavens turn. Eliza thought of the life she had been running from, the life of silk and salons that had been promised to her. It felt like a story about someone else, a pale and lifeless tale compared to the vibrant, difficult, and beautiful reality she had found. Jonah's voice, when he spoke, was a soft rumble in the quiet of the night. He was not looking at her, but up at the stars, his words a simple, wondering echo of a memory that now belonged to them both. She was promised the East's finest. He turned his head, his profile outlined against the starlight, and looked at her. A slow, gentle smile touched his lips, but her future lay beneath the western sky. Eliza smiled back, her heart so full it felt as if it might spill over. She reached out and took his hand, his large, strong fingers lacing through hers. Their grip was warm, solid, and sure. It was a beginning. Thank you for being part of our story tonight. We would love to see where you are listening from in the comments so we can all connect. And do not forget to subscribe to our channel Wild West Night, like this video, and press the hype button to help more people find this tale.